Welcome, dear listeners, to today's episode of the English Globe. We are truly glad you've chosen to spend your time with us. Today's discussion focuses on a moment that has drawn the world's attention: the meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump in Alaska. This was not just another diplomatic visit. It was a rare, carefully planned, high-stakes summit that could have consequences for global politics for years to come.
This meeting matters because it brought together the leaders of two of the most powerful nations at a time when the world is facing deep divisions and ongoing conflicts. The war in Ukraine remains unresolved. Sanctions are reshaping the global economy, and security alliances like NATO are recalibrating their strategies. Every word spoken in Anchorage could influence the direction of these challenges, and the choices made here may set the tone for future diplomacy.
Before we continue, dear listeners, we'd love your support. If you enjoy exploring global events and understanding them in depth, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the English Globe. This helps us bring you more carefully researched and thought-provoking episodes. And if you're listening on YouTube, click that notification bell so you won't miss our next discussion.
We also want you to join the conversation. In the comments section, tell us where you are listening from, your city, your country, and share your thoughts about today's topic. Do you think meetings like this can help bring peace, or do you see them more as symbolic gestures without real impact? Your views matter to us, and they often inspire the questions we explore in future episodes.
Now back to the heart of today's subject. On August 15th, 2025, Anchorage, Alaska, became the center of world attention as President Donald Trump hosted President Vladimir Putin at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. This location was not chosen by accident. It sits roughly halfway between Moscow and Washington, and it's home to some of the most advanced aircraft in the U.S. arsenal, including the F-22 Raptor and the F-35 Lightning II. The message was clear: America was hosting this meeting from a position of military strength.
The scene was striking. As the presidential motorcades arrived, cameras captured red carpets, military honor guards, and carefully arranged photo opportunities. The U.S. military staged an impressive aerial display with stealth bombers and fighter jets flying overhead. This was diplomacy framed in a show of power. It was also a reminder to Moscow that Washington maintains formidable capabilities, even while sitting down to talk.
The stakes were enormous. This was the first in-person meeting between these two leaders since President Trump's return to the White House earlier this year. While there have been phone calls and indirect exchanges, face-to-face diplomacy is different. The ability to read body language, to test reactions in real time, and to hold private discussions away from the microphones can shape outcomes in ways no written statement can.
The primary topic was the war in Ukraine, now in its fourth year since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Both leaders came with sharply different goals. President Trump has signaled that he wants to broker a ceasefire, but one that doesn't appear to be a surrender by Kyiv. President Putin, on the other hand, wants recognition of Russia's control over certain Ukrainian territories and security guarantees about NATO's future expansion. Reconciling these visions will not be easy.
But Ukraine wasn't the only matter on the table. Discussions also included sanctions relief, nuclear arms control, prisoner exchanges, and energy cooperation. Each of these issues connects to the others. For instance, lifting sanctions could be tied to military de-escalation, and energy deals could influence the willingness of allies to support or oppose certain agreements. This web of interests made the Alaska talks both complex and fragile.
What made this summit even more significant is the timing. International attention is divided. Conflicts in other regions, economic uncertainty, and climate-related crises compete for headlines. Yet, when these two leaders met, news outlets from every continent tuned in. That tells us something. The US-Russia relationship still sits at the core of the international order, and any shift in its tone or direction can send ripples across the globe.
In the days leading up to the meeting, both leaders managed expectations. President Trump described the summit as a chance to find real solutions, but he avoided promising immediate breakthroughs. President Putin said Russia was ready to talk, but insisted that realities on the ground, meaning Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine, must be respected. Those statements showed that while both sides were willing to engage, their starting points were far apart.
And that gap is exactly why so many analysts were watching closely. Was this meeting a genuine attempt to end a war? Or was it political theatre meant to show domestic audiences that their leaders are active on the world stage? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Summits often blend both substance and symbolism, and the Alaska talks were no exception.
Dear listeners, that's why we're taking the time today to unpack this event from every angle. In this episode, we'll explore the symbolism of the location, the strategic messaging, the potential agreements discussed, and the reactions from allies and adversaries alike. We'll also look at what this means for Ukraine's future and for the wider balance of global power.
So, as you listen, remember to add your voice to the discussion. Let us know in the comments. Do you believe this meeting will change the course of the war, or will it simply be remembered as a symbolic handshake in Alaska? We'll be reading and responding to your insights, because this conversation is bigger than just two leaders. It's about the future of peace and stability in our world.
Dear listeners, now that we've set the stage for the historic Putin-Trump talks, let's explore why the meeting took place in Alaska. At first glance, it might seem like a simple geographic choice. Anchorage is roughly halfway between Washington, D.C. and Moscow. But when we look closer, we see that the decision carries deep symbolism, careful strategic calculation, and even subtle psychological messaging aimed at both domestic and international audiences.
Geography is the first reason worth noting. If you were to draw a direct line between Moscow and Washington, Anchorage is one of the most practical meeting points that falls within U.S. territory. For both leaders, it meant avoiding the optics of traveling deep into the other's homeland while still meeting face-to-face. That's important because optics matter in diplomacy. A neutral yet strategic location can send the message that neither side is bending too far to accommodate the other.
But beyond the map, there's the military factor. The talks were held at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, a major U.S. military installation. This base houses advanced aircraft, like the F-22 Raptor, F-35 Lightning II, and strategic bombers. During the summit, the U.S. Air Force staged a display that included stealth bombers and fighter jet flyovers. These weren't random theatrics. They were carefully planned demonstrations of capability, a reminder to Russia and the world of America's air dominance.
Hosting the summit on a military base also gave the U.S. complete control over security. This was critical given the sensitivities of the meeting. Anchorage saw road closures, restricted airspace, and a heavy presence of security forces. Everything from the placement of cameras to the order of arrival was meticulously managed. Such a setting reduces the risk of unexpected disruptions and ensures that the host nation shapes the environment from start to finish.
Alaska also carries historical weight in U.S.-Russia relations. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire in what became known as the Alaska Purchase. This moment in history is one of the few direct territorial transactions between the two countries. While no one explicitly brought it up during the summit, the choice of location subtly reminded both sides, and the watching world, that their relationship stretches back more than a century and a half.
And there's more. Alaska is a gateway to the Arctic, a region becoming increasingly important in global politics. Climate change is opening new shipping routes and exposing untapped natural resources. Both the United States and Russia are Arctic powers with military and economic interests in the region. Meeting in Alaska places that strategic theatre in the background, a quiet reminder that future cooperation or competition will play out in these icy waters.
The symbolism doesn't stop there. Alaska is home to both American and native Alaskan communities, some of which have cultural and historical ties across the Bering Strait to Russia's Far East. This adds a human dimension to the meeting, a reminder that despite geopolitical rivalries, there are people-to-people connections between the two nations that go back generations.
Hosting the summit here also allowed the US to blend hospitality with subtle messaging. Red carpets, ceremonial salutes, and military honors were extended to President Putin, but in a setting that clearly emphasized American power. The backdrop of aircraft hangars and US flags wasn't just for decoration. It framed every photo and video clip in a way that reinforced who was hosting and on whose terms the meeting was taking place.
For President Trump, the choice of Alaska also played well with his domestic audience. It projected an image of strength, meeting Putin without leaving American soil, while still appearing open to diplomacy. For President Putin, it allowed him to be seen engaging with the United States at a location that, while militarily significant, was not the White House or the Kremlin, helping him frame the meeting as taking place on more neutral ground.
Another layer is the logistical advantage. By holding the summit in Alaska, travel times were reduced for both leaders, minimizing the strain of long transcontinental flights and the associated security complexities. This practical choice meant both delegations could arrive, conduct talks, and return home more quickly, reducing the risk of extended media speculation or unexpected political developments during their absence.
But perhaps the most important reason for choosing Alaska was the narrative it allowed. Every summit tells a story, not just in what is said, but in where it happens. By meeting in Anchorage, the U.S. framed the encounter as strong yet approachable, strategic yet open to dialogue. It suggested that America was willing to engage with Russia, but not on terms that required crossing oceans or stepping into a rival's political heartland.
This location also signaled to allies that the US remains in control of the agenda. NATO members watching from Europe could see that the meeting took place on US terms, with American security arrangements and symbolism woven throughout. At the same time, it showed adversaries that the US can host talks without compromising its strategic posture. This balancing act between diplomacy and deterrence is one of the most difficult in international relations.
And while the choice of Alaska may seem like a small detail compared to the outcome of the talks, history has shown that settings matter. Think of past summits: Reykjavik during the Cold War, Camp David for Middle East peace, or Geneva for US-Soviet arms control. The place becomes part of the message, shaping how the world remembers the meeting. Alaska may well join that list in the years to come.
So, dear listeners, as we move into the next part of our discussion, keep in mind that nothing about this summit was accidental. Not the timing, not the participants, and certainly not the location. In diplomacy, every choice sends a signal, and Alaska's signals were loud and clear. In our next section, we'll step inside the meeting room and talk about who was present, what was on the agenda, and how those choices shaped the tone of the talks.
Now we move inside the room where the historic discussions between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin took place. This was no ordinary meeting. The air was tense, every word measured, and every gesture carefully considered. Trump was joined by his top advisors, including his Secretary of State and senior foreign policy strategists. Their role was not only to advise, but also to observe the subtle reactions of the Russian delegation, noting every pause, glance, and expression.
Opposite them, President Putin was flanked by his most trusted officials. His foreign minister, defense advisors, and economic strategists sat nearby, ready to provide instant counsel. The room was arranged to emphasize equality, yet assert subtle dominance. Seating positions, the placement of documents, and even the direction of the sunlight through the windows were considered. In diplomacy, dear listeners, even small details can convey messages as powerful as the spoken words.
The summit began with the customary handshake, lasting longer than usual. It was a handshake that conveyed formality and control, projecting strength and composure from both sides. From that moment, cameras and journalists outside knew that this was a meeting where both presidents intended to assert their positions, signaling that nothing would be surrendered lightly. Every photograph, every second, became part of the global narrative before a single topic was even discussed.
Once the formalities ended, the conversation moved to the main agenda: Ukraine. Trump emphasized the urgency of a ceasefire and the importance of involving Ukraine in any negotiations. He spoke of ending the conflict swiftly to save lives and stabilize global markets. Putin, on the other hand, stressed that any resolution had to respect Russia's security concerns and territorial gains. The room, while calm, was electric with unspoken tension, as both sides measured how far they could push their objectives without breaking diplomatic decorum.
Beyond Ukraine, the talks covered sanctions, nuclear security, and economic cooperation. Trump highlighted that any relief from sanctions would be contingent on measurable progress in de-escalation. Putin's advisors, meanwhile, introduced ideas about energy cooperation and financial arrangements that could serve as incentives for progress. The discussion became a careful dance of proposals, counterproposals, and strategic positioning, with both sides aware that a single misstep could jeopardize months of planning.
Throughout the session, the leaders were remarkably composed, yet attentive to nuance. Trump asked precise questions about Russia's intentions in disputed regions and expressed concern about the humanitarian impact of ongoing conflicts. Putin responded with detailed arguments about geopolitical pressures, historical context, and strategic necessities. It was a meeting of intellect and influence, a chessboard of ideas where each statement carried weight far beyond the room itself.
The atmosphere was disciplined but charged. At moments, silence filled the room as both sides contemplated their next words. Advisors whispered quietly, passing notes or offering quick clarifications. The energy fluctuated, sometimes heavy with caution, other times lighter when tentative agreements or mutual understandings emerged. Even small gestures, a nod, a brief smile, or leaning forward, were noted as indicators of openness or resistance.
Trump sought to convey firmness without aggression, insisting that progress would require accountability. Putin aimed to communicate readiness while preserving flexibility, signaling that concessions might be possible under specific conditions. Each side probed the other's limits, testing what could be achieved in a single meeting, fully aware that the global audience was watching closely. Every nuance would be dissected in the press and among allies long after the handshakes ended.
Economic discussions also took a central role. The potential to reopen trade channels, coordinate on energy exports, and adjust sanctions frameworks was explored. These were not abstract discussions. They directly affect international markets, global supply chains, and domestic economies on both sides. The room became a forum for practical strategy as much as political negotiation, bridging diplomacy with real-world consequences.
By the end of the first day, the leaders had covered considerable ground. Agreements were tentative and phrased carefully to avoid overcommitment. Progress was acknowledged without creating expectations of immediate solutions. As the room emptied, advisors reflected on the intensity of the exchanges, knowing that what was achieved inside would shape political and economic developments for months.
Dear listeners, this glimpse inside the room shows how much preparation, strategy, and subtle communication goes into high-level diplomacy. Trump and Putin did not simply talk. They engaged in a structured, highly orchestrated interaction designed to explore possibilities while protecting each nation's interests. The choices made here, words spoken, documents exchanged, gestures observed, would influence global politics far beyond Anchorage.
And that's what makes this summit so fascinating. It was not only about reaching agreements, but about demonstrating power, testing boundaries, and shaping perceptions. The inside of the room, though closed to the public, became a stage where the future of international relations, the fate of Ukraine, and the stability of global alliances were quietly negotiated, observed, and understood in ways that words alone cannot capture.
As the meeting progressed, one of the most fascinating aspects was the tone set by both leaders. Tone in diplomacy is not just about what is said, but how it is said. Trump spoke deliberately, using pauses to emphasize his points, while Putin maintained a calm, measured cadence. Every phrase, every inflection carried weight. In moments of agreement, their voices softened, suggesting potential cooperation. In moments of disagreement, firmness and a clipped pace signaled boundaries that would not be crossed lightly.
Body language also played a critical role. Trump often leaned forward slightly, emphasizing engagement and intent, while keeping his gestures controlled to avoid appearing aggressive. Putin, conversely, remained upright and composed, occasionally folding his hands or nodding subtly. These physical cues communicated confidence and authority, each leader signaling that while they were open to dialogue, neither would be rushed or pressured. Observers often note that in diplomacy, what is unspoken can be as influential as what is said aloud.
The interplay of tone and gesture set the rhythm of the negotiation. When discussing Ukraine, the atmosphere shifted. Trump's emphasis on immediate humanitarian and economic concerns contrasted with Putin's focus on long-term strategic security. Each point was carefully calibrated to assert priorities while inviting discussion. There were no sudden outbursts or dramatic confrontations, but every glance and gesture conveyed intention, making the dialogue as much a psychological game as a factual discussion.
Silence was just as telling as speech. Periods of quiet allowed each side to evaluate the other, to anticipate the next move. During these pauses, advisors whispered, notes were exchanged, and subtle signals were sent across the table. For instance, a brief nod from Putin could indicate openness to a particular proposal, while a deliberate pause from Trump might suggest a need for further clarification or a strategic reconsideration. Diplomacy in these moments was a finely choreographed dance.
Humor, surprisingly, appeared sparingly yet strategically. A light comment from Trump occasionally eased tension, signaling that despite high stakes, the conversation could remain personable. Putin responded minimally, with restrained acknowledgement, demonstrating receptiveness without diminishing authority. These rare interludes of levity offered brief psychological relief and reminded both parties that negotiation, even at the highest level, contains human elements.
Another subtle factor was the sequencing of topics. By beginning with less contentious issues, such as energy cooperation and minor trade arrangements, the leaders established a rhythm of dialogue before moving to more sensitive matters. This allowed each side to gauge reactions, adjust strategies, and maintain engagement without immediate confrontation. The flow of topics revealed a deep understanding of negotiation psychology, showing that preparation extends beyond facts into the orchestration of timing and tone.
Trump often employed repetition for emphasis, gently restating key points to ensure clarity and reinforce his positions. Putin responded with deliberate elaboration, providing historical and strategic context that framed Russia's stance. This dynamic created a rhythm in the room: assertion, clarification, response, and strategic pause. Both sides were conscious that the world was watching, even if only through limited reporting, and that every nuance could shape global interpretation.
The negotiators' seating arrangements and eye contact were equally telling. Those closest to the presidents acted as extensions of authority, signaling support and readiness to advise. Eye contact was measured. Too much could appear confrontational. Too little could signal disinterest. Both leaders maintained careful balance, alternating direct engagement with brief exchanges to their aides. In diplomacy, these seemingly small actions convey respect, attentiveness, and power simultaneously.
Emotional control was another hallmark of the session. Both Trump and Putin maintained composure despite high stakes, despite differing priorities, and despite subtle provocations. Moments of tension were met with calm expressions, measured speech, and strategic pauses. Neither side allowed emotion to dominate, demonstrating that mastery of self-presentation is as critical as knowledge of policy in high-level diplomacy.
By the end of this segment of the summit, the tone in the room was professional, guarded, and cautious, yet constructive. Each leader had tested boundaries, assessed intentions, and observed reactions. Though no final agreements were yet reached, the dynamics indicated that dialogue was productive and that both sides were willing to explore areas of potential compromise. Listeners, this is the essence of high-stakes diplomacy: patience, perception, and psychological insight at every turn.
In conclusion, the tone, body language, and subtle interplay inside the Alaska summit illustrate that negotiation is an art as much as a science. Words, gestures, pauses, eye contact, and sequencing all contribute to shaping the outcome. For the world watching, these details may seem invisible, but for leaders and their advisors, they provide critical information about intentions, flexibility, and priorities. Understanding this human layer helps us see why such meetings carry far more weight than headlines alone can convey. Dear listeners, now we move into the heart of the summit, the key discussions and proposals exchanged between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine remained the central topic, but the conversation extended to sanctions, nuclear security, energy cooperation, and broader geopolitical stability. Each proposal was carefully weighed, revealing both leaders' priorities and strategic thinking. The room was filled with a sense of purpose, tension, and calculated diplomacy.
Trump began by emphasizing the urgency of a ceasefire. He stressed that the ongoing conflict was creating global instability, humanitarian crises, and economic turbulence. He proposed immediate humanitarian corridors, temporary ceasefires in contested areas, and coordinated monitoring by neutral observers. His message was clear: any progress needed to save lives and stabilize international relations while keeping Ukraine actively involved in the process.
Putin responded with conditions. He highlighted Russia's security concerns and insisted that any agreement must respect Russia's strategic interests. Territorial considerations were central, with Putin outlining that Russia required recognition of certain gains made during the conflict. At the same time, he signaled willingness to discuss ceasefires and humanitarian measures, indicating that flexibility existed but only within carefully defined boundaries.
Beyond Ukraine, sanctions became a major point of negotiation. Trump proposed a phased approach to lifting specific sanctions if measurable progress was achieved. He emphasized that economic relief could serve as an incentive for cooperation, helping both nations stabilize their markets while demonstrating goodwill. Putin's advisors countered by suggesting adjustments in trade and energy policies as reciprocal gestures, highlighting the interconnectedness of diplomacy and economic strategy.
Energy cooperation was another significant proposal. Trump suggested discussions on coordinated oil and gas exports to balance global supply and reduce volatility in energy prices. Putin indicated that Russia could participate under mutually beneficial terms. This aspect of the talks demonstrated that even while political tensions remained high, both leaders recognized the importance of economic collaboration as part of broader negotiations.
Nuclear security was also addressed, though carefully. Trump reaffirmed U.S. commitment to existing arms control treaties while proposing limited new measures for transparency and monitoring. Putin, in turn, emphasized Russia's interest in maintaining strategic parity and avoiding destabilizing escalations. Both leaders expressed that dialogue on nuclear issues was essential for global security, framing their conversation as forward-looking rather than reactive.
The summit also touched on regional conflicts beyond Ukraine. Trump raised concerns about hotspots in the Middle East and Central Asia, emphasizing the need for cooperative diplomacy to prevent escalation. Putin highlighted Russia's role in Syria, Iran, and other areas, advocating for multilateral approaches while asserting that unilateral actions could exacerbate tensions. This demonstrated that the Alaska talks were not confined to a single issue, but were part of a larger framework of global influence.
Another layer of discussion involved strategic trust and verification. Both leaders recognized that agreements are only as effective as the mechanisms to monitor compliance. Trump proposed regular bilateral communication channels and joint inspections for any ceasefire zones. Putin suggested reciprocal oversight measures, ensuring that Russia's security concerns would be addressed while promoting transparency. These proposals reflected an understanding that diplomacy requires both commitments and enforcement mechanisms.
Importantly, the proposals were framed with an eye on perception. Both leaders knew that the world was watching closely, and every word could be interpreted as a signal of either strength or compromise. Trump carefully emphasized American resolve while showing willingness to negotiate. Putin balanced firmness with flexibility, demonstrating that Russia could engage constructively without appearing weak. This careful framing was as much about public perception as it was about substantive progress.
By the end of these discussions, preliminary understandings had emerged, humanitarian measures were tentatively agreed upon, and channels for further negotiation were established. No final agreements were signed, but both sides acknowledged that progress had been made in clarifying positions, building mutual awareness, and exploring practical solutions. The room, once tense and formal, now held a cautious optimism.
Dear listeners, these key discussions and proposals highlight the complexity of high-level diplomacy. Each leader brought priorities, strategies, and constraints to the table. Every proposal was a negotiation, every counter-proposal a calculated move. Understanding the content of these discussions gives us insight into how global decisions are made, how compromise is structured, and how leaders balance domestic pressures with international responsibilities.
In conclusion, the Alaska talks were not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a layered, nuanced exchange of ideas, priorities, and strategies. They demonstrated that diplomacy is a marathon rather than a sprint, requiring patience, planning, and careful attention to detail. What was proposed in this room will influence not only immediate outcomes, but also the broader trajectory of US-Russia relations for months and years to come.
Now that the Alaska talks concluded, the global response was immediate and multifaceted. International media outlets highlighted different aspects of the summit. Some focused on the symbolic handshake and the cordial yet tense atmosphere. Others emphasized the discussions on Ukraine and sanctions. The press portrayed the event as a delicate balancing act, where progress was cautious but significant, revealing the intricate nature of high-level diplomacy.
In the United States, reactions were mixed. Supporters praised President Trump for engaging directly with Russia and attempting to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine. Many political analysts noted that the tentative agreements and proposals reflected strategic patience and a willingness to explore multiple pathways to peace. Critics, however, argued that no concrete agreements had been finalized, and they questioned whether the summit had effectively addressed the core issues at stake.
In Russia, media coverage projected confidence. The government emphasized President Putin's firm stance on security concerns and territorial issues. Russian outlets highlighted the fact that Putin had engaged constructively with the U.S. while maintaining sovereignty and strategic interests. The narrative suggested that Russia had successfully participated in high-level diplomacy without making significant concessions, sending a message of strength and calculated engagement to both domestic and international audiences.
European nations also closely monitored the summit. Leaders in NATO and the European Union expressed cautious optimism but insisted on Ukraine's central role in any agreements. They welcomed the dialogue as a step toward reducing tensions. Yet they remained wary of unilateral deals that might overlook Kiev's perspective. The summit prompted immediate consultations among European capitals, reflecting the interconnected nature of international diplomacy and the ripple effects of US-Russia negotiations.
Global markets reacted as well. Investors scrutinized statements from the leaders and looked for signals regarding sanctions, trade, and energy cooperation. Even tentative proposals for lifting certain sanctions influenced trading patterns in commodities and currencies. Analysts noted that the meeting had a calming effect on some sectors, suggesting that dialogue between the two powerful nations could reduce uncertainty, though cautious skepticism remained.
Social media, of course, became a platform for public reaction. Clips of the handshake, exchanges, and press briefings were shared widely, generating debate among citizens worldwide. Some praised the civility and professionalism displayed, while others criticized perceived vagueness or lack of immediate results. These discussions reflected a broader trend. Diplomacy today is observed not only through official channels, but also through rapid, real-time global commentary.
In Asia, governments monitored the summit closely, particularly regarding security and regional stability. Nations with strategic interests in Ukraine, energy, and trade analyzed every proposal and statement. For some, the summit represented an opportunity to understand US and Russian priorities better. For others, it raised questions about how future negotiations might affect regional alliances, military planning, and economic cooperation.
Middle Eastern countries also followed the developments. Leaders considered implications for conflicts in Syria, Iran, and other hotspots where US and Russian influence is strong. Analysts noted that the tone and outcomes of the Alaska talks could influence future negotiations and cooperation on broader security issues, including arms control, counterterrorism, and economic investments. The summit's global resonance extended far beyond Ukraine alone.
Within international organizations like the United Nations, diplomats studied the summit's statements carefully. Security Council members examined whether proposals aligned with international law and existing resolutions. While no formal resolutions emerged directly from the meeting, the dialogue between the two leaders provided insights into potential future cooperation, shaping how multilateral institutions might approach conflict resolution and humanitarian support.
In conclusion, dear listeners, the reactions after the Alaska summit illustrate the far-reaching impact of high-level diplomacy. Media coverage, political commentary, social media debate, and international observation all contributed to a complex tapestry of perception. The meeting influenced not only the direct participants, but also governments, organizations, investors, and citizens around the world, demonstrating that diplomacy operates on many levels simultaneously.
The summit's aftermath reminds us that the significance of a diplomatic meeting is measured not just by agreements signed, but by how it shapes conversations, perceptions, and expectations globally. The Alaska talks, though preliminary in tangible outcomes, set the tone for future negotiations and provided a window into the intricate mechanisms through which international relations are conducted. After the closed-door negotiations concluded, both leaders faced the press, and this moment was crucial for framing the summit's outcomes. The room was filled with journalists from around the world, cameras flashing, microphones poised. Public messaging was carefully crafted. Each word, each pause, each gesture was meant to communicate strength, progress, and control, even if the real details of the discussions remained behind closed doors.
President Trump began by highlighting what he described as productive dialogue. He emphasized the willingness of both sides to explore solutions for Ukraine and global stability. His tone was confident yet measured, signaling that progress had been made without overpromising. He addressed questions about sanctions, humanitarian corridors, and military tensions, maintaining a balance between optimism and caution. showing that negotiations were serious but ongoing.
President Putin, in his turn, reiterated Russia's commitment to security and strategic interests. He framed the discussions as a constructive step toward understanding and potential collaboration. His speech was formal and precise, with a calm demeanor that conveyed authority. He emphasized Russia's position without signaling compromise beyond carefully considered parameters, projecting an image of control and deliberate engagement for both domestic and international audiences.
The interplay between the two leaders during the press conference was striking. Trump occasionally smiled or nodded in response to journalists' questions, signaling openness. Putin remained reserved, offering concise, well-structured answers. The contrast in style reflected each leader's approach: Trump's more personable, accessible manner versus Putin's disciplined, authoritative presence. This contrast itself became a topic of global commentary, highlighting the human element in international diplomacy.
Questions from the press ranged from specifics about Ukraine and sanctions to broader geopolitical concerns. Both leaders skillfully navigated these inquiries, providing enough information to demonstrate progress while withholding sensitive details. Listeners, this is a common tactic in high-level diplomacy. Transparency is balanced against strategic ambiguity, ensuring that no concessions are made publicly before internal deliberations are complete.
Trump emphasized that the talks were a first step, framing them as an initial dialogue aimed at building trust and identifying potential solutions. He underscored the U.S. commitment to working with allies and Ukraine, signaling that further negotiations would involve multiple stakeholders. Putin, meanwhile, highlighted Russia's willingness to engage in ongoing discussion, emphasizing continuity and stability in international relations, portraying the summit as a controlled and professional exchange.
Body language remained key during the press conference. Trump gestured with his hands to underscore points and leaned slightly forward to engage the audience. Putin maintained a straight posture, hands folded or resting calmly on the podium. Eye contact was deliberate, giving the impression of careful consideration. These nonverbal cues reinforced the verbal messaging, ensuring that confidence and seriousness were projected at every moment.
Both leaders carefully avoided language that could escalate tensions or create misunderstandings. Trump spoke of progress, opportunity, and collaboration without promising immediate solutions. Putin emphasized cooperation, respect for sovereignty, and security imperatives, avoiding statements that could be interpreted as weakness or concession. The press conference became an exercise in controlled communication, blending diplomacy, media strategy, and psychological presentation.
The world observed closely, analyzing phrasing, tone, and gestures. Markets, governments, and citizens interpreted statements as signals of potential policy shifts or forthcoming negotiations. Analysts debated whether the summit indicated real progress or merely a symbolic exchange. Social media amplified these interpretations, with clips, quotes, and commentary spreading globally, demonstrating the powerful ripple effect that a carefully managed press appearance can create.
In conclusion, dear listeners, the press conference was more than just a reporting session. It was an extension of diplomacy itself. Through words, tone, and gestures, both Trump and Putin framed the summit in ways that balanced transparency with strategy. They communicated intent, projected confidence, and set the stage for future negotiations, showing that in international relations, what is said in public is as strategically important as what is discussed behind closed doors.
For those observing from afar, the press conference revealed the leaders' ability to control narratives, manage global perception, and maintain diplomatic decorum under intense scrutiny. It illustrated that high-stakes diplomacy operates on multiple levels simultaneously: private negotiation, strategic communication, and public messaging, all intertwined to shape outcomes and influence the global stage. As news of the Alaska summit spread, the world began analyzing its outcomes and potential implications. In capitals across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, diplomats closely examined every statement from Trump and Putin. Governments considered what the discussions might mean for regional stability, ongoing conflicts, and strategic alliances. The summit's reverberations were immediate, prompting careful evaluations by foreign ministries, think tanks, and international observers.
In the United States, reactions were varied. Supporters of President Trump highlighted his direct engagement with Russia as a sign of leadership and initiative. They argued that opening channels of communication was essential for global stability and potentially beneficial for the U.S. economy. At the same time, critics expressed concern that insufficient concrete outcomes had been achieved, questioning whether the administration had secured any meaningful commitments on Ukraine, sanctions, or other strategic issues.
Domestic political analysts emphasized the high stakes of perception. Trump's supporters applauded the demonstration of American influence and resolve, noting that the press conference projected confidence and seriousness. Opponents, however, stressed the lack of immediate results, suggesting that headlines emphasizing productive dialogue could obscure the absence of enforceable agreements. These contrasting interpretations revealed how public opinion and political narratives can shape perceptions long after the summit ends.
In Russia, the media and government communications highlighted President Putin's firm yet constructive approach. Russian outlets focused on the balance between engagement and sovereignty, portraying the summit as a diplomatic success that preserved strategic interests while maintaining openness to negotiation. The messaging emphasized control, competence, and preparedness, reassuring domestic audiences that Russia had acted decisively and maintained influence on the international stage.
European reactions were largely cautious but observant. Leaders in NATO and the European Union welcomed the dialogue as a positive development, but stressed that Ukraine must remain central to any agreements. The summit prompted consultations among European capitals, evaluating potential consequences for collective security, economic coordination, and regional diplomacy. Analysts noted that the Alaska talks could influence future negotiations, alliances, and policy decisions across the continent.
In Asia, governments with strategic interests in energy, security, and trade analyzed the summit closely. Countries like China, Japan, and India considered the implications for regional stability, observing whether US-Russia dialogue could create opportunities or challenges. Analysts examined the proposals regarding energy cooperation and economic exchanges, recognizing that such negotiations might affect global supply chains and regional partnerships in subtle but meaningful ways.
Middle Eastern countries also monitored the developments with great attention. Leaders in Syria, Iran, and neighboring nations evaluated how the US-Russia dialogue could impact ongoing conflicts and influence regional power dynamics. The discussions in Alaska were viewed as a potential precursor to broader cooperation or negotiation on other geopolitical issues, including security coordination, arms control, and economic initiatives, highlighting the interconnectedness of global diplomacy.
Global markets reflected the immediate influence of the summit. Investors analyzed both verbal and nonverbal cues from the leaders, looking for indications about sanctions, trade, energy, and conflict resolution. Even tentative proposals, carefully worded statements, and public gestures influenced stock prices, commodities, and foreign exchange rates. Financial analysts emphasized that diplomacy and economics are deeply intertwined, with political developments often shaping market behavior before formal agreements are signed.
Within international organizations, diplomats examined the summit's implications for multilateral decision-making. The United Nations, for instance, considered how discussions about Ukraine and broader security concerns could shape future resolutions, peacekeeping strategies, and humanitarian interventions. Although no binding agreements emerged, the Alaska talks provided insight into the priorities, constraints, and negotiation styles of two of the world's most influential leaders.
In conclusion, dear listeners, the reactions to the Alaska summit demonstrate that diplomacy resonates far beyond the meeting room. Domestic political narratives, international analyses, economic markets, and public perception all interact to shape understanding of the outcomes. The summit's significance lies not only in what was agreed upon, but also in how it influenced governments, organizations, and citizens worldwide, illustrating the far-reaching impact of high-level diplomatic engagement.
The Alaska talks remind us that global diplomacy operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Private negotiations, public statements, and international interpretation create a complex web of influence. The way the world responds can be as important as the discussions themselves, shaping future relations, policy decisions, and perceptions of leadership for months and even years to come. Dear listeners, as we step back from the immediate reactions to the Alaska summit, it becomes clear that its significance stretches far beyond headlines or daily news cycles. The discussions between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin have long-term strategic consequences for U.S.-Russia relations, global security, and the balance of power. The seeds planted in this meeting will influence diplomacy, negotiations, and decision-making for months, if not years.
One major long-term implication is the potential recalibration of U.S.-Russia engagement. Both leaders signaled openness to dialogue, suggesting that even in areas of disagreement, communication channels can remain active. This could reduce the likelihood of sudden escalations in conflicts such as Ukraine and other regions where the two countries have competing interests. The summit set a precedent for direct, high-level conversations, emphasizing negotiation over unilateral action.
Economically, the proposals on sanctions, trade, and energy cooperation could shape long-term financial and industrial strategies. Even tentative agreements and understandings influence global markets, corporate planning, and investment strategies. Energy discussions, in particular, could affect oil and gas exports, pricing, and regional supply chains. The summit demonstrated that diplomacy is not isolated from economics. Political decisions have cascading effects across the world's financial systems.
Strategically, the Alaska summit highlighted the importance of predictability in international relations. By observing each other's negotiation style, tone, and priorities, both leaders gained insight into potential future behavior. This understanding enables more informed decision-making, reduces uncertainty, and allows for better anticipation of responses in crises. For allies and adversaries alike, these insights are invaluable in shaping policy and preparing for possible scenarios.
For military and security considerations, the summit underscored the ongoing significance of dialogue even amidst tensions. Discussions about conflict zones, nuclear security, and strategic priorities provided signals about red lines, acceptable compromises, and potential areas for cooperation. Nations worldwide, including NATO members, monitor these developments closely to calibrate defense strategies, alliance commitments, and contingency planning, reflecting the far-reaching impact of high-level negotiations.
Politically, the summit influenced domestic perceptions in both countries. Trump's engagement with Putin reinforced his image as a leader willing to negotiate directly on the global stage, while Putin's participation projected Russia as a decisive and competent actor. These internal perceptions have consequences for future elections, domestic policy, and national narratives, showing how diplomacy at the highest level often intersects with domestic political considerations.
The summit also has implications for multilateral institutions. By clarifying the positions and priorities of two global powers, the Alaska talks inform the strategies of organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and regional coalitions. These institutions use such information to coordinate policy, respond to crises, and shape collective approaches to security, humanitarian aid, and economic development, demonstrating how bilateral diplomacy can ripple through multilateral systems.
Beyond immediate policy, the talks set a tone for global diplomacy. They signal that even with deep disagreements, dialogue remains possible. This long-term message may influence other nations' approaches to negotiation, encouraging patience, strategic planning, and careful assessment of both risks and opportunities. It reinforces the principle that diplomacy is a continuous process, requiring time, attention, and a willingness to engage constructively.
In conclusion, dear listeners, the Alaska Summit's long-term strategic consequences are profound. From shaping U.S.-Russia relations and influencing economic decisions to providing insights for military planning and multilateral diplomacy, the meeting was far more than a single event. Its effects will be felt across governments, organizations, and global markets, reminding us that high-level diplomacy is an ongoing, deeply influential process with outcomes that unfold over years.
The key takeaway is that the summit demonstrated both the complexity and necessity of sustained dialogue. Negotiations at this level are never about immediate results alone. They are about positioning, perception, and strategic planning. The choices made, the signals sent, and the understanding gained in Alaska will continue to shape global relations, proving that diplomacy is as much about foresight and patience as it is about agreements and headlines.
As we reach the conclusion of our detailed discussion on the Alaska Summit between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin, it is important to reflect on what we have observed and learned. This meeting was not a simple exchange of words. It was a complex choreography of strategy, diplomacy, and global messaging. From private negotiations to the public press conference, every moment carried weight and consequences.
The summit demonstrated the importance of preparation and awareness. Both leaders brought teams of advisors, experts, and strategists to support every move. Each phrase, gesture, and response was calculated to achieve objectives while maintaining authority. The dynamics inside the room illustrated that high-level diplomacy involves psychological acuity as much as knowledge of facts, policies, or treaties, reminding us that human behavior shapes the course of global events.
One key takeaway is the balancing act between cooperation and assertion. Trump and Putin sought to advance dialogue while protecting national interests. They carefully navigated contentious issues such as Ukraine, sanctions, and security, showing that even in moments of disagreement, diplomacy requires patience, nuance, and strategic restraint. Every proposal, counter-proposal, and tentative agreement reflects this delicate equilibrium between compromise and firmness.
Another significant aspect is the role of public perception. From the handshake to the press conference, both leaders communicated messages to their citizens and the world. The narrative crafted for domestic and international audiences matters greatly, influencing political legitimacy, market confidence, and alliance dynamics. As we have seen, global diplomacy is performed not only in private rooms, but also on the stage of media and public opinion.
Economically, the summit emphasized the interconnection between politics and markets. Even preliminary discussions on sanctions, trade, and energy cooperation had ripple effects on global markets and investor confidence. These conversations demonstrated that decisions made in high-level meetings affect not only geopolitical stability, but also economic systems worldwide, reinforcing the idea that diplomacy is multidimensional in both scope and impact.
Strategically, the summit offered insight into long-term planning and negotiation. Both leaders gained understanding of each other's priorities, red lines, and negotiation style. This knowledge will influence future interactions, shaping policies, alliances, and crisis responses. The summit set a framework for sustained dialogue, showing that diplomacy is continuous and cumulative, not limited to single events or headline moments.
For international observers, allies, and critics, The Alaska talks provided clarity on U.S. and Russian intentions, priorities, and flexibility. Even without immediate binding agreements, the meeting allowed governments and institutions worldwide to adjust strategies, anticipate outcomes, and respond proactively. This highlights the broader influence of high-level diplomacy, where even preliminary discussions create global implications.
Looking ahead, future expectations include ongoing dialogue, monitoring of agreements, and careful attention to implementation. The summit established channels of communication, clarified positions, and created opportunities for negotiation on sensitive issues. The global community will be watching how these discussions evolve, particularly regarding Ukraine, sanctions, energy cooperation, and strategic security, with implications for both regional and international stability.
In summary, dear listeners, the Alaska Summit was a powerful example of modern diplomacy. It illustrated the complexity, strategy, and patience required at the highest levels of international relations. From private negotiations to public messaging, from economic considerations to security discussions, every aspect of this meeting contributes to shaping the trajectory of U.S.-Russia relations and global stability.
Finally, the summit reminds us that diplomacy is a long-term process. Outcomes unfold over months and years, influenced by perception, negotiation, and strategic planning. For global leaders, policymakers, and citizens alike, understanding these dynamics is essential. As we observe future developments, the Alaska talks serve as a benchmark for how dialogue, patience, and strategic engagement can influence the course of international affairs in meaningful and lasting ways.